In this section, we're going to take a quick look at life and life processes of organisms. Some of this is going to be a review from biology. Some of it may be a little bit new, but it's just kind of an introduction to some key terms that are going to be essential as we look at different organisms throughout the semester. Starting with being able to get energy. All organisms carry out some form of cellular respiration, which is breaking down sugars to be able to release energy. The way in which they get those sugars may vary. Some organisms are autotrophs. They can sometimes be referred to as producers because they make their own food within their cells. There's two ways that organisms can go about accomplishing this. One process is called chemosynthesis. This typically occurs deep in the ocean where there's a variety of what we would consider to be toxic chemicals. They're able to absorb these and convert them into sugars for themselves. The other process is photosynthesis, which is being able to use carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight to be able to produce sugars. In order to accomplish this, the organisms have to have some form of pigment, a substance which absorbs light from the sun. If an organism isn't an autotroph, then it's going to be a heterotroph, meaning that they are a consumer. They get their food from some outside place. They can do this in a variety of ways. They may be an herbivore where they feed on only autotrophs. They could be a carnivore, meaning that they feed on other heterotrophs. They can be omnivores, feeding on other autotrophs or heterotrophs. They can be decomposers, which means that they're responsible for breaking down anything that's already dead and returning nutrients to the environment. Now, as different organisms produce food and feed on one another, there's a couple of different ways of being able to look at this. You've probably heard of food chains and food webs before. A food chain is a linear look at how organisms feed. Energy often starts with the sun. There are organisms that produce their own food that are autotrophs. There are organisms that feed on them, and so on up along through the different levels of feeding. However, within the oceans and most environments, it's not quite so simple. There are a lot of interactions between different organisms. It's a very complex web of being able to feed, and removing any of the individuals within it can cause significant problems. A trophic pyramid is an interesting form of a food pyramid, but looking at what's going on within a particular environment. These food pyramids can be used to represent the amount of energy at each of the different feeding levels within a food chain or food web, the numbers of individuals, or the literal mass of organisms at each level. Typically, the most amount of any of these is going to be at the very bottom. This is where you have the autotrophs producing food. Only 10% is going to be found at the next level. So of all the energy produced by the autotrophs, only 10% of that energy is going to get passed on to the next level, and so on up through the food chain. Same thing with numbers. However many individuals there are that are primary producers, only 10% of that number is going to be the primary consumers, and so on. Cellular organization is particularly important when looking at different types of organisms. There are two general types of cells that an organism could have. There are prokaryote cells and eukaryote cells, and they have a number of distinct differences, some of which can be seen fairly easily by looking at these two diagrams. Prokaryote cells have very few structures within them, while eukaryote cells have many structures that help to divide up the work that needs to be accomplished within the cell. Prokaryote cells are typically very small. The largest prokaryote cells are still smaller than most of the smallest eukaryote cells. Eukaryote cells in general are much larger. Prokaryote cells are often referred to as being old simply because they have existed as a type of cell on our planet for a very long period of time. This was most likely the first type of cell that came into existence. Eukaryote cells, on the other hand, are much younger, meaning that they developed much later in Earth's history. Prokaryote cells are always unicellular. They're only found as single cells, whereas eukaryote cells are usually, they can be found with just one cell, but oftentimes they're found with many cells put together, making up a multicellular organism. The prokaryote cells are found only in bacteria, while eukaryote cells are found in everything else. When we look at organisms in their environment, there's different levels at which organisms can be studied. You can look at a single individual, which isn't going to provide you with a whole lot of information, or you could try to look at a species as a whole, which is pretty difficult to do. Typically, you're going to be looking at groups of organisms of a particular species within a certain area, and that's referred to as a population. But those populations of species don't exist by themselves. There are other organisms that live in the same area. So all the living organisms found within a particular area that interact with one another are known as a community. But the living things aren't there by themselves. There's all sorts of non-living factors that influence their ability to live, function, and survive. And so when you take into account all the living and non-living parts of a particular location, you have an ecosystem. Within the oceans, there's a variety of different conditions that organisms have to deal with, one of which is salinity. Diffusion and osmosis has to do with the movement of water and salts into and out of cells, and this can have a tremendous impact on organisms because in general water moves much more quickly in or out of cells than the salts do. The best environment for an organism to be in is one that's considered to be isotonic. That's where the salts are in equal concentrations both inside and outside the cells. Everything is already in balance. It's when the salinity starts to change in their environment that it starts to have an impact on them. If the salinity in their outside environment increases significantly, it can cause them to lose water. Water will move out into their environment, and that would cause their cells to shrink. When their cells shrink, everything becomes compressed, and it's much harder for the cells to function. If the salinity in the outside environment decreases significantly, then water can move into the cells, causing the cells to expand outwards. This can also cause them to lose a lot of their nutrients, and if a cell expands too much, it can actually burst, in which case the cell will no longer function at all. In dealing with these conditions, there are some organisms that are known as osmoconformers. This means that whatever the outside environment is, their cells are going to follow. They're going to change with the environment. More complex organisms are osmoregulators, meaning that regardless of what the salinity is outside, they have the ability to maintain a constant concentration of salts within their body, meaning that it's not going to have as much of an impact on them if the salinity in their environment starts to change. In dealing with temperature, first there are poikilotherms. This is sometimes referred to as being cold-blooded, though it's not an accurate representation of what's going on here. Basically, it means that as the environment's temperature changes, their body temperature changes as well. The heat that they have may come from the outside environment. That's referred to as being ectothermic. Why reptiles of various forms lay out in the sun is because they are ectothermic. They're trying to absorb heat from the sun to control their temperature and keep their metabolism up. There are some types of poikilotherms that are endothermic. This is sometimes referred to as being warm-bodied. This means that they can generate some heat within their body, and so while their body temperature does go up and down, it does stay slightly above whatever the environment happens to be. The opposite of a poikilotherm is a homeotherm. This means that their body temperature stays constant all the time, sometimes referred to as being warm-blooded. Homeotherms are entirely endothermic. They generate their own heat in order to maintain that constant temperature. In order to do this, however, it does require lots of energy. Different forms of reproduction. There's asexual reproduction, where one individual makes a copy of itself by some form of cell division. The new individuals that are produced by asexual reproduction are the same as the original. With sexual reproduction, this is where two reproductive cells are joining together to create a new individual. And the new individual created is typically going to be different compared to what you had at the beginning. Now, there are two terms that go along with this that are going to come up as we are looking at different types of organisms. One is monoecious. This means that you have an individual that is both male and female at the same time. Other organisms are dioecious, meaning that there are separate individuals that are either male or female. All of these come into play with different reproductive strategies. Some organisms are capable of just asexual or sexual reproduction, while others are only capable of just one. Within the oceans, there is a very wide range of different types of organisms, and keeping them organized is important. So organisms are classified in a particular way, grouping them by their characteristics. One of the key characteristics that they use is the the evolutionary relationships between different organisms. In this class, we're going to look at both scientific and common names. Common names vary from one place to another, whereas scientific names are constant throughout all of science throughout the world. The classification scheme that is used, you've probably seen this before, goes from very generalized groups of organisms, starting with kingdom, and gets more and more specific as you move along through these until you have just one particular type of organism or species. If you take a group of species that are similar to one another and put them together, they all belong to the same genus. A group of similar genera all belong to the same family, similar families belong to the same order, and so on upwards. In terms of kingdoms, we currently have 6 kingdoms that are in use. Originally there were just 2, plants and animals, but now there are archaea, bacteria, protists, fungi, and plants and animals that organisms belong in. And we will take a look at organisms that belong to all of these different kingdoms. The scientific names for organisms originates from this classification scheme, and it's a system known as binomial nomenclature. It's a 2-part naming system, and it comes from the lowest levels, or more specific levels of organization, the genus and the species. The genus is always capitalized, and the entire scientific name is either underlined or written in italics. Some relationships with organisms in the oceans include symbiosis. It's a close relationship between 2 different species. There's different ways that this can happen. There's mutualism, where both organisms benefit from the relationship. Commensalism, where one organism is benefited and nothing really happens to the other. And the third is parasitism, where one organism benefits and the other organism is harmed. With parasitism, it's important to note that the organism that is harmed shouldn't be killed. This would be a disadvantage to the parasite, the organism that is receiving a benefit from the relationship. Symmetry can often be an indication of the complexity of an organism. The simplest of organisms are typically asymmetrical, meaning their body isn't particularly balanced in terms of shape. Slightly more complex are those that are radially symmetrical. That means that if you divide the body out into segments from the center, they're going to be similar. So circular types of organisms. And then there's bilateral symmetry, meaning if you divide them down the middle, they're going to be the same on 2 sides. Our final thing that we're going to look at here is some different ocean lifestyles. Nectonic organisms are those organisms that are capable of swimming, propelling themselves through the water. Organisms that are found right along the bottom or attached to or living in the bottom are known as being benthic. Organisms that are drifting around or are weak swimmers are planktonic. With the planktonic organisms, there are 2 general types. There's phytoplankton, those that are producing their own food, And there are zooplankton, those that are feeding on other small organisms. In terms of plankton, organisms can be holoplankton, meaning that they spend their entire life as plankton drifting around. Others are meroplankton, meaning that there are certain stages within their life that they spend as plankton. So these are some of the basic terms that we're going to come across as we're looking at organisms. I really wanted to introduce these now so that we don't have to define them and make it an additional thing to learn as we go.